Welcome to another fine episode of Pixel Talk, the show where we discuss what it means to be human from a pixel's point of view. And now, here is your host, Fivezy.
Good morning. It's August 12, 2021, and it's a Thursday. Here in LA, a sunny morning with a few clouds out there. Very still right now. 70 degrees Fahrenheit, around 21 Celsius. Today I was thinking about the year 2013 and Willie Nelson and Paula Nelson's version of Have You Ever Seen the Rain? This afternoon it'll be going up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, around 33 Celsius, and it looks like we're going to be enjoying beautiful blue skies and golden sunshine all along the way. But after yesterday, I wouldn't be surprised if there were a few clouds joining in. We'll see. Everyone, have a great day.
Church, a Christian community of some 500 congregants.
Hey! You enjoyed church this morning? How was that?
Enjoyed it.
Hey, y'all!
He did it in part by buying up a former Kmart and slowly converting it into a church.
Hey, it's Bertha, how are you?
But he wouldn't have made it if he hadn't also done something unique. Opened up a for-profit coffee shop in the lobby and taken on tenants next door. So far, a fitness center, with plans to add a grocery store next year. Now, DeMoss is trying to sell faith leaders on his economic vision, that to survive in today's world, all churches need to be structured more like businesses.
Traditionally, churches are run in a funding way through tithes and offerings. The people attend your church, they put money into the offering plate, it pays the bills, it pays the salary of the pastor, it pays the mortgage payment. There is a business model to the church. We don't like to talk about it. People don't want to necessarily think about it, but there is an economic reality to every church. The more that people joined our church, the homeless, the immigrant, the undocumented, the poor, it cost us money. And we realize if we're going to have effective ministry, we're going to have to develop multiple streams of income.
So if you want to open a church in a place like this, you have to find another way to make some money.
That's not just an urban reality anymore. people attending church, offerings going down. It doesn't matter now if you're in the suburbs. See, what we learned in the inner city 20 years ago is now true across the country.
The challenge is real. The number of adults who say they attend church weekly has declined steadily over the past several years. Just 65% of Americans describe themselves as Christian, down from 77% a decade ago. Studies how changes like this are impacting the Little Rock religious community.
I think that religion is less central to American life than it used to be, and people just are not identifying with formal religious institutions and finding spiritual fulfillment through them the way that they used to in generations past.
Are you seeing churches start to turn to alternative sources of income, including running their own businesses even?
Congregations that maybe aren't using these large buildings, they're starting to think about how they might repurpose them. Some people are just letting nonprofits or letting 12-step programs use that space for free. Some are really looking ahead to how they can use that as a way to fill that income gap.
Mixing money and religion
Isn't exactly new, and it hasn't always turned out so well.
Do you ever use your private jets to go visit your vacation homes, for example?
A pastor at a local megachurch stands up for buying his wife a $200,000 Lamborghini.
Pastor Creflo Dollar asks his followers to buy him a $65 million private jet.
DeMoss says what he's proposing is about necessity, not excess.
Again, thanks to all the sponsors and all the sponsors helping to make it work. We really appreciate that.
The venture itself is for sale. He's sold about 5,000 copies of his book.
This definition has some issues, and we're going to get to that. But for now, it works well enough as a frame to allow us to go over the most frequently occurring types of witches in media. Probably the most common type of witch that you can find in film and other media is the satanic witch, which you could also find being referred to as a biblical witch or an Abrahamic witch, who derives their powers from a direct sexual relationship with Satan, like the witches in Rosemary's Baby or Hocus Pocus. These are the Salem witch trial brand of witches that were actually put to death in real life. There's the sword and shield high fantasy witch that was most common in the 1980s and appeared in works like The Sword and the Sorcerer, Sorceress, The Lord of the Rings, Troll, Berserk, The Black Cauldron, Fire and Ice, and Dead Time Stories. The source of their magic is typically not very well explained, and are the least based in reality out of all of the witches. It is most common here also to find male witches out of all of these subcategories, often referred to as wizards, warlocks, magi, conjurers, magicians, or sorcerers. They may be part animal, frequently are nude, usually are accompanied by some sort of ancient magical object, and are common still in many video games, television shows, tabletop games such as Dungeons & Dragons, and card games like Magic the Gathering. There's the pagan witch, also known as the traditional witch or natural witch, like those featured in Midsummer, Halloween 3, The Love Witch, The Craft, and Apostle. And here I should say that I'm not talking about real-life Wicca or neo-pagan witches, but more so the idea that has formed about them in media that over time has combined with the ideas taken from early Middle-Age pagans as well from different regions of Europe. These types of witches frequently gain their power from nature and are very nature-based in everything that they do, and aren't tied to anything that we would commonly associate with Abrahamic religions for the most part, except for the occasional worship of a horned god. They also might gain their powers from within by using their willpower, similar to the teachings of the early 1900s witch Aleister Crowley, or through the emotions that are tied to specific acts such as sex, violence, or crying. These types of witches may use potions from herbs, period blood, other bodily fluids, or even hair, and may celebrate solstices, read tarot cards, burn candles, dance in rituals, and study the stars. Their power is in the earth, and everything that they do brings humanity back to its basic forms in nature. These types of witches, when presented in media, also do not have to be evil per se, and in fact they are usually presented as neutral as opposed to straight good or evil.
True magic is neither black nor white. It's both because nature is both, loving and cruel, all at the same time.
The pagan-style witch is probably the most wide and difficult category to define because it contains so many different concepts and ideologies within it, from many different real places and time periods in world history, such as the Thelemists, Wiccans, Pagans, Santeros, Neo-Pagans, Voodoo, Druids, Stragaria, folk witches, and other nature-based styles of witchcraft across different pieces of media in different decades. Then there is the plain generic witch, that has been most often used in children's media like Snow White, Harry Potter, Wizard of Oz, most of Miyazaki's work, The Witches, or Halloween Town. These witches are usually very much in line with the Christian witches, just more toned down and not aligned with Satan. Their basis in magic is rarely explained, and it often isn't brought up where they get their powers from. Hereditary witches are common here also, passing their magic down through their family line, like the witches in Harry Potter, Kiki's Delivery Service, and Teen Witch. They are just witches and have no familiars or demons that they call upon for power. They are just powerful and need no explanation for the story to function. Almost kind of like a sister species to regular humans. If they are evil, then they tend to be more evil in a generic sense as opposed to evil in a direct satanic sense as well. But the imagery is still pretty similar between the two. And a lot of the time, like in Halloween Town, Harry Potter, or Kiki's Delivery Service, the witch isn't actually evil at all. And these four categories honestly are a little bit too vague and could be narrowed down even more if we worked on it a bit further. But for our purposes in this series, they will work. The word witch can be used in many different ways for different things. Too many things even. This is sometimes even brought up within stories about witches, such as in The Craft, where Sarah gets confused to learn that her new friends don't worship Satan because they are instead pagan-style witches but still have very real magic. It also does not help that in all forms of media, the lines between these four styles of witchcraft can be blurred quite extensively, where creators will pick and choose different aspects that they like from different categories to support the needs of their stories. So the question of what exactly is a witch is a complicated one to answer. It can be a term of self-empowerment that one uses for themselves. It can be a way of life. It can be an insult that at one time was powerful enough to result in death. The long history of the word means that the connotation that it is used in could bring about a host of different ideas and images from different times in the past 1,000 years. So I think to figure out where our current primary notions of witches originates from, we have to turn back to the time of the 1200s to see the origins of the witch purges that would eventually begin fully in the late Middle Ages.
recluse, writer of many spiritual works in 19th century Russia, has this to say on the naturalistic theories of origins that had made their appearance in his time. The truth of God is simple. Can a proud mind study it? Such a mind would rather think up its own things, sensational things, although empty and as weak as a spider's web. To see that this is so, look at the current theories of the creation of the world. They are like a somnambulistic or drunken delirium. And yet how good they seem to those who invented them. How much energy and time are wasted on this, and all in vain. The deed was accomplished simply. He spake, and they came to be. He commanded, and they were created. Psalm 148, verse 5. No one can think of anything better than this solution. In another place, St. Theophan continues the same theme. What ought we to preach? The saint asked. We should cry to all, sons of the kingdom of heaven. Don't run from the kingdom into bondage and slavery, for they are in fact running. Some are captivated by freedom of mind. They say, we don't want the bonds of faith and the oppression of authority, even divine authority. We'll figure things out and make up our minds for ourselves. So they have made up their minds. They have built fables in which there is more childishness than in the mythology of the Greeks, and they magnify themselves. Others are enticed by the broad path of the passions. They say, we don't want to know positive commandments or the demands of conscience. This is all abstract. We need tangible naturalness. And they have gone after it. What has come of it? They have bowed down before dumb beasts. Has not the theory that man originated from animals arisen from this moral fall? This is where they have gone, and everyone runs from the Lord. Everyone runs. Elsewhere, St. Theophan wrote that Darwinism, together with other godless philosophies from the West, is deserving of formal condemnation by the Orthodox Church. These days, many nihilists of both sexes, naturalists, Darwinists, spiritists, and westernizers in general have multiplied among us. All right, you're thinking, would the Church have been silent? Would it not have proffered its voice? Would it not have condemned or anathematized them if there had been something new in their teaching? To be sure, a council would have done so without doubt, and all of them, with their teachings, would have been given over to anathema. To the current rite of orthodoxy, only the following item would have to be added. To Buchner, Feuerbach, Darwin, Renan, Kardec, and their followers, anathema. But there is no need, either for a special council or for any kind of addition. All of their false teachings were anathematized long ago. At the present time, not only in principal cities, but in all places and churches, the rite of orthodoxy ought to be brought in and celebrated, so that all the teachings contrary to the Word of God might be collected, and that it might be proclaimed to everyone what they must fear and from what teachings they must flee, and all might know. Many are seduced intellectually only through ignorance, and therefore a public condemnation of pernicious teachings would save them from destruction.
As the Catholic Church began to spread their reach in the first 1,000 years of their existence, they inevitably incorporated practitioners of different pagan folk religions into their fold. And a lot of these rural, mostly unpopulated areas still held on to their old traditions and ways of doing things well after joining the church. May Queens were still celebrated, but now instead of praising different nature deities such as Floralia, the goddess of flowers, they now worshiped Mary. Pagan rituals were still practiced as tradition, and magic was not yet seen as heretical, but instead only as a folk remnant of a time gone by. That was until the Inquisition that started in the 1250s and was designed to root out heretics that threatened the future existence of the church. We like to think of Catholics and later Protestants as being witch crazy, and it's true that for a time they were. But for roughly the period of the first 1300 years of the church, witches were not really seen as a major part of Christian theology. There are only 13 instances in the Bible that the word witchcraft is used directly, and most of them are not gendered uses of the word. 2 of the verses are in references to male witches, and 3 of them are in reference to female witches. So it is clear that witches were a part of the faith and belief system of Abrahamic religions, but in a minor part that up until the 1400s did not have a role in day-to-day life. Witches in this early period were really undefined, as they were usually in most texts not specifically gendered, and they were only vague references to different types of sorcerers, healers, magicians, and other practitioners of witchcraft that mostly left the details to the imagination of the reader or listener. The Canon Episcopi in the year 906 was a Catholic document that even declared witchcraft as a fantasy, saying that pagan traditions practiced by those who lived in rural areas of the Holy Roman Empire were merely that, traditions, and that they should not be seen as either valid to Christian faith and theology or heresy, but more so just a part of the rich cultural histories that were passed down through families for generations. As a result of this, witches were punished under civil law instead of ecclesiastical law, meaning that they could not be tried for heresy, which was punishable by death at the time. Magic in this time was also separated into 2 categories, white magic and black magic. White magic, which consisted largely of healing and divination, was not a crime at all, while black magic that consisted of spells intended to harm people were punished by fines, imprisonment, and banishment, but not death. White magic was seen by most as beneficial and was defended by the general public for its uses, but white magic could have been tried as black magic if the spell resulted in a death. By the time of the 1400s, these 2 categories will have disappeared entirely, and both types of magic would be tried as heresy across all of Europe. The first major incident that would eventually lead to the witch purges came in the form of a papal bull of Alexander IV in 1258, which declared that the inquisition of heresy crimes involving magic should be left up to local authorities unless they had proof that manifest heresy was involved in the crime, such as praying to false idols, offering sacrifices, or consulting with demons. It was with this that the prospects of eventual witch trials gained their first legal footing. Before the Black Plague of the mid-1300s, women actually held a higher, more equal standing in most European societies than we like to imagine. In England, for instance, women actually had stronger laws protecting their inheritance than men did. And even though the sexes were not equal, they also largely at the same time did not have the patriarchal makeup that the late Middle Ages would come to have. But as the Catholic Church began to restrict the previous customs and ceremonies that were not strictly based in Christianity, that they had previously ignored from those who descended from pagans, women from these pagan origins would have to start gathering in secret at night to trade their wisdom of the old ways amongst each other. Before the plague, hag was considered a compliment. It was an honor for a woman to reach an old age, as older women were seen as wise and knowledgeable in medicine and were important figures in the survival of a community. But after the plague, people looked for a source to blame, and those involved with medicine and health who lived alone at the edge of town were now seen as suspicious of making people sick. And the word witch began to be used to pass guilt for the plague onto these healers and healthcare workers. Masks of shame started to be strapped to the heads of women accused, and the process of investigating these crimes started to become more and more barbaric. But the horrific progress of investigating witches was slow. Some were executed for their crimes, but for the most part, Alexander IV's bull from 1258 was respected, and women's rights were still protected under it. As under local courts, witches were jailed for some time or tortured and then released, but not put to death. People grew tired of what was viewed as relaxed actions that local courts took against Malefica, and tensions grew among the commons until one day in France, a suspected group.
Christ says, "Hear another parable. There was a certain landowner who planted a vineyard and set a hedge around it, dug a wine press in it and built a tower. And he leased it to vine dressers and went into a far country. Now, first you right away need to see the image in your mind. The image, again, is an image, a cosmic image of a basic pattern of reality. You can imagine a tower, imagine it in the middle. It's a lot easier to imagine it that way. So imagine a tower in the middle, and imagine now the vine, the vines that go down, and then at the bottom you have this hedge which is around it, which separates it from other things, which is kind of the limit, the wall, the barrier between this world that is here in terms of the vineyard and the rest of the world, let's say. And so you can imagine that from the beginning, when things are planted, or the beginning of the vine, moving towards the moment where the vintage is drawing near, the moment where the reaping, where the fruits of this world are going to become manifest, where we're going to see what the fruit of this vine is. Now, the vine, the vineyard was received from above. It was a kind of kingdom of heaven, you have to understand it as. And so it is received from the owner, which is obviously an image of God, but it works at every level. It doesn't only work as a parable of how God interacts with the world, but it also works also at a level lower, almost directly at where the parable is talking about, the way that the parable is actually talking about this owner and the people he leases it to. So we can understand that whatever it is that we hold from below, we necessarily take it from above, right? The unity of the world that we participate in must come from above, right? So you can imagine this not just as a vineyard, but as let's say a sports team. There's something from above. There's an ownership, there's a direction which comes from above, and participating in that, moving towards the championship, manifesting the fruit of this purpose that we're participating together is the same as this vineyard. And so these husbandmen or these vine dressers received the vineyard from above, and they participate in it, and they're going to be able to partake of its fruits, but they don't. The actual ownership of the vineyard is not theirs. As the time of the fruits are drawing near, the vine dresser, the owner of the vineyard, sends his servants. You can imagine them as angels. You can imagine them as messengers from above. Imagine it in let's say in a company. The boss of the company sends down messages to see if the workers are doing what they're supposed to, if they're bringing in the profits, and if they're bringing them back, they're giving them to where they're supposed to be within the company, let's say. And so he sends his servants one by one. They are killed, they're beaten, they are rejected, basically, right? So what you have is a situation where the multiple agents of the vineyard, they want to take the authority for themselves. They want to take the ownership for themselves. And they don't want to recognize that they received this from above. They want to be able to just take the fruits of this world without recognizing where the world comes from, without recognizing the thing which binds the world together, the authority, the name, the nation, the team, whatever it is. There's something which binds all this multiplicity together. Now they don't want to recognize that, and so they get rid of the messengers. They get rid of whatever is coming at some point from above. Things are coming from above. They refuse them, and they think that it's going to work. And then it says, of course, this parable is ultimately talking about prophets, and of course talking about how Christ then comes into the world. The anointed one comes down. The very, it's a reason why the team itself exists.
Found him frequently falsifying records to match his arguments better and to gaslight people, and to resume much that had not actually been proved. He did not condone Kramer's obsession over Helena's sexuality, which he brought up consistently during her trial, asking question after question again and again about her sexual history when it did not pertain to what they were talking about. Gulser eventually had enough, and in 1486, he went against the orders of the Pope and ended the trials before they were completed. And after exchanging several unsuccessful letters with Kramer, he publicly demanded him to leave the district and never return. And after a time, Kramer did indeed comply with Gulser and left the city. But out of his narcissism, in response to his expulsion and rejection from Innsbruck, Kramer began to write the Malleus Maleficarum, and published it the next year, including Innocent VIII's papal bull as an insert into the front of the book that declared him to have the authority to hunt witches in any way that he deemed necessary. As a result of the book being so widely read and known by priests, scholars, and nobles in different countries, this work alone, granted by the authority of the Pope, started the period of the vicious witch trials that continues in some places to this day. In the 100 years after its publication, the minimum estimate is that 50,000 people were burned alive as suspected witches. And since 2005, at least 3,000 people have been killed in Tanzania for the same reason. It is a problem that was mostly born here that has never fully gone away since its inception. And so, if you trace all of this back to this book, then it is clear to me at least that Heinrich Kramer is directly responsible for the deaths and persecution of an untold amount of people, most of them women, that has continued for hundreds of years past his own death. This book alone is a symbol that words based around fear and the unknown truly do have power. But what does it really
The action of an anathema is terrible to some, then let him avoid the teachings that lead to it. Let him who is afraid of it, for the sake of others, bring them back to a healthy teaching. If you who are not favorably disposed to this action are orthodox, then you are going against yourself. And if you have already lost sound teaching, then what business do you have concerning what is done in the church that supports it? After all, you've already separated yourself from the church and have your own convictions, your own way of looking at things. Well, live with them then. It's all the same whether or not your name and your teaching are uttered under the anathema. You are already under anathema if you philosophize against the church and persist in this philosophizing. Saint Theophan predicted that if naturalistic evolutionary notions of the world's origin continued to be propagated, the resulting loss of faith among the Russian people would help pave the way for the overthrow of the Orthodox Christian government of Russia. Less than 3 decades later, his prediction would be fulfilled. As he observed, people have suddenly had a thought and have started to write about preserving faith. But they don't want to block the source of unbelief. This source is the spread of the teaching that the world formed by itself, according to which there is no need for God and the soul does not exist. It's all atoms and chemistry, nothing more. This is being preached at university rostrums and in literature. He who breathes these fumes is inescapably stupefied and loses his sense and faith. Until these books are destroyed, until professors and literary men are forced not only not to hold to this theory, but even to demolish it, until then, faithlessness will grow, and with it, self-will and the destruction of the present government. That's the way the French Revolution went. Already in his time, Saint Theophan saw that science was increasingly becoming a godless enterprise, which worked from the assumption that nature is all there is, and that therefore materialistic explanations can account for everything that exists. At the same time, he saw that the natural sciences were being falsely held up as the most reliable and authoritative source of knowledge. In various places, he spoke of this increasingly pervasive problem. There is not a single science which could be established solidly on its own principles. Something can be obtained from all the sciences, but this is not something that gives one the right to cite science as a decisive authority. It is not science itself that is the problem, but scientists who twist science however they want. Consequently, there are only the conjectures and inferences of scientists. In vain do people think highly about the world and its laws, about nature and its forces, as if there were something untouchable, indisputable, and inviolable in them. Under the appearance of science, they are devising for themselves an idol worship that is more destructive than the mythological idol worship of the ancient Greeks. No, brethren, it is not by the laws and forces of nature that the life of each one of us is upheld, but by the power of God acting within us. The Lord, upholding all things by the word of his power, Hebrews 1:3, bears each one of us by the same word of his power. Let us maintain this thought in our mind and imprint it in our heart. The all-active power of God bears us over the abyss of nothingness, and we live and move and have our being, Acts 17:28. If he takes away his spirit, if he removes his hand, we will disappear and will no longer be remembered among the living. But if the Lord holds us, then he touches us. He does not merely see us mentally. No, he touches us, as one hand touches another, or as the air touches one's body. How consoling and awesome! Elsewhere, St. Theophan reflected on what can happen to a person's outlook when he does not keep scientific knowledge in a position subordinate to his Christian faith. A pure spirit, nous, contemplates God and receives from him knowledge of mysteries. But even the spirit, combined with the body, after the diversity of the creations of the visible world has been revealed to it through the senses, having been enlightened by the same inward illumination from above, must contemplate in these creations all the mysteries of the knowledge of God and the mysteries of God's making and governing of the world, so that even when faced with this great amount of knowledge, it can remain unperturbed in the same single divine contemplation. But, having fallen, a person is captivated by the diversity of created things and even overwhelmed by impressions from them, which supplant within him the very thought of God. Studying created things, he goes no further than what he sees in them, their composition and interrelations, and, not receiving illumination from above, does not see in them the clear reflection of God and the divine mysteries. The world has become for him a tarnished mirror, in which nothing can be seen but the mirror itself. Hence, a great amount of knowledge suppresses within him the knowledge of the one thing. It turns him away from it, makes him cold toward it. Such is the price, and such is the fruit of science in a fallen state.
With a fly, but says that ointments cause this, and only mentions broomsticks once directly, as at one point he says that a witch rubs one with an ointment made of a child to make it fly. But today we commonly associate witches as flying on broomsticks, and this didn't happen immediately within the purges, but instead slowly grew with time. And in fact, the story of how brooms came into the picture is kind of an interesting one, because it is one of the few examples of a scholar at the time being brave enough to oppose the culture that agreed with the ideas that were slowly formulating about witches. Guillaume Adeline was a French prior, an Augustine, and a doctor of divinity, which essentially means that he was about as well educated as a person could have been at the time. And in 1453, he publicly said that it was impossible for witches to exist, and that the devil could form no pact or contracts with humans. He was arrested for this, and tortured for days, until he finally confessed that he signed the devil's book, had slept with the devil who had come to him in the form of a sheep to satisfy himself sexually, that he had kissed the devil's second face, that he had flown to meet the devil on several occasions on a broom, and that he had lied about the whole thing and said that witches couldn't exist, also to sexually satisfy himself. He repented and was allowed to live the rest of his life in prison, and this is the first instance that a broom is mentioned in connection to witches. The origin
So of course, then Christ says one of the very mysterious things is that the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone, and this was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in your eyes. This is, of course, the mystery of, even you could understand this mystery as something which is happening now. That is that sometimes you don't see the reason for what you're doing right away. You see the reason, you see the unity of a group when the fruits start to appear. And this is a fascinating thing which is being suggested, is that sometimes the seed, or sometimes the reason for things manifesting themselves, things emerging in the world, actually don't appear until the very end. And the end of something manifests its origin and also manifests the reason why it existed in the first place. This is important for people who are interested in things like natural selection to understand, because people tend to think that when we say, let's say, that eyes are foreseen, they'll say, oh, that's a post, that's a meaning which is added afterwards, right? That the reason when we say eyes are foreseen in a kind of a natural selection way is just something we add on top of a chaotic situation, of a chaotic selection. But that is actually how the world works, is that the seed usually remains hidden for a long time. And then suddenly when you see the fruits of something, then you can recognize the seed, you can recognize the meaning. There's a wonderful quote by St. Gregory of Nyssa who says, the animal comes first and then comes the spiritual. That in a human person, but in anything, often we see the kind of chaotic, or these phenomena gathering together in a way that at first we're not sure what exactly is happening. And then when the fruits start to appear, then we realize that there was a logos bringing it along, all along. There was a logos pulling it towards its purpose, even though we couldn't recognize it at the time. And of course, in terms of this particular parable of the vineyard, you can understand it very immediately as, imagine again, I like using sports analogies, even though I'm not a big sports fan, but they're easy to understand. And so you can imagine that there's a team. Imagine that all these teams have a goal, have something which is making them united. Let's say hockey players in Canada, they all have something, an authority, which is binding them together. And that authority would manifest itself in the capacity to give the Stanley Cup to the winning team, right? And so the authorities, they bestow this cup to show who it is that came the closest to the goal. And so if team members amongst one team, they say, well, if we could get rid of this thing, this authority that binds us together, this authority, whatever, the NHL that's taking massive profits from us, or the owner of the team which is taking massive profits from us, if we could just take it for ourselves, then we would have way more, right? Obviously it makes sense. But then, of course, if that happens, then the team will actually break apart and cease to function, and will no longer have the capacity to even win the Stanley Cup. And so the cup and the authority and the recognition will then fall on another chosen team, which will then become the ones who are the new, let's say, the new fruits of this whole enterprise that started in the first place. And so it can give you an idea of how it is that Christianity doesn't at all present itself as revolutionary, but rather tries to show how things below have to be in order to become the kingdom, in order to participate in those things which come from above. And so I want to now look at the second one, which is as harsh as this first one, and it is the parable of the wedding feast. It is
systematically tries to prove that women are weaker than men, calling them the fairer sex, but also saying that they have deeper capacities in all aspects of life than men, and that is why they should be controlled as to protect the human race. He says in one part that women have no moderation in goodness or in vice, and when they are governed by a good spirit, they are the most excellent in virtue, but when they are governed by an evil spirit, they indulge the worst possible vices. And in another part that the lust of men leads them into one sin, but the lust of women leads them into all sins. And the reason he does this is so that he can be as harmful as possible, while also not contradicting Christian theology. Because by the logic that he creates here, witches can exist in the same theological space as the Virgin Mary, with one representing ultimate wickedness and the other ultimate virtue. He is creating new theology here using logic based in old theology to do so. And he finishes his arguments in these two chapters by saying that the reason witches need to be hunted to extinction is because the nature of women makes it more likely for witches to grow into great numbers if nothing is done about them. He says that they have slippery tongues and are unable to conceal from the fellow women those things which by evil arts they know. And since they are weak, they find an easy and secret manner of vindicating themselves by witchcraft. In which he means simply that women can't help but gossip to each other about everything. So naturally, they couldn't help but share what the devil told them in secret. And by that logic, pretty soon, every woman in the world would be a witch, with this evil knowledge that they share together if nothing was done about it. And thus, witch hunts were the only rational option to fight this. And also by saying this, Kramer vilifies the very act of a woman having friends, making it suspicious for one woman to talk to another about anything because of the way that it could have been perceived, making an opposition to his ideas and new theology impossible to ever form. Everything he does is to make sure that counter-arguments to what he suggests could potentially be punishable by death. By the time of the Protestants in the early 1500s, the witch crisis was in full motion, and they adopted the Malleus as their guidebook for their own trials as well. In 1522, Martin Luther called witches the devil's whores, and complained that lawyers looked for too much evidence and spent too much time deliberating before deciding on convictions. This was also the time that Nostradamus rose to popularity within European societies, particularly in Italy, and it is kind of interesting to see how he skirted being burned alive for decades, because he was reportedly very scared his entire life of the Inquisition coming after him for heresy. To avoid this, he sided with the church as often as he could, and with this he was at least publicly very against the Protestant Reformation and used his popularity to voice concerns of things that went against the views of the Catholic Church. It also helped that by this point, prophecy and astrology were only seen as being connected to magic instead of being outright practices of magic. It was rumored that in private, Nostradamus did attempt other types of magic such as necromancy, or was at least interested in it. But publicly, he only presented himself as a seer, which was technically not illegal in some areas, but only technically. So the church never really went after him, but he also was really lucky that that didn't happen. And
in the Holy Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 22, starting at verse 1. And Jesus answered and spoke to them again by parables and said, the kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who arranged a marriage for his son and sent out his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding. And they were not willing to come. Now, first of all, it's important to see, he's saying, this is what the kingdom of heaven is. So remember from the Beatitudes, the idea of you have heaven above, and then you have the kingdom. The kingdom is the extent to which heaven has manifestation in the world, right? It is manifestation gathered together under an authority. That's what a kingdom is. So this is what he's saying. This is how the kingdom of heaven works. And you'll see that it's actually how all of reality works, and it's actually revealing a very interesting mystery about the fall itself and how the fall participates in bringing about the kingdom despite its scandal, let's say. And so you can imagine it as a mountain. So the king is in the castle above, and now all the people are down below. Let's say the higher people up on the mountain are people that are higher up in the social hierarchy. The people that are lower down on the mountain are those that are lower down in the social hierarchy, all the until you get down to the very bottom, right? Where you have good and bad people that you can't even discern whether they're good or bad, let's say, at the bottom. And so he sends out his servants, and his servants go down the mountain and now start to call people up to go up into the wedding feast, which is being held above. So again, he sent out other servants saying, tell to those who are invited, see, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and fatted cattle are killed, and all things are ready. Come to the wedding. But they made light of it and went their ways, one to his own farm, another to his business. So you can imagine now lower down, the thing which is making people not go up the mountain to the wedding feast is that they are distracted by other gods, right? They are distracted by other points of attention, which although in themselves aren't bad, but they are, if you now attend to your business and you attend to your farm without understanding how all of this is held together by the kingship and the heir of the king, then you're going to lose your farm at some point. You're going to lose your business because as society fragments, it's just going to be taken over by the outside. And so the first thing they needed to do was to recognize the wedding feast and to recognize this union of heaven and earth, because that's what a wedding feast is. The union of heaven and earth, which happens at the top of the mountain in the king's castle, is the point by which even their now secondary attentions are able to exist, right? But they don't see that. They want to pay attention to their secondary things. Now, this is the first level. So imagine you have the purpose, the idea of attending to the feast, then attending to all these different things. And if you just attend to these different things, which don't recognize the unity of the union of heaven and earth, then after that is actually going to come hostility towards that which is above. So the first is distraction, and then lower down on the mountain is hostility. And so it says, and the rest seized his servants, treated them spitefully, and killed them. When the king heard about it, he was furious. And so now they rebel against the king, and so the king sends down his armies. It says, and he sent down armies, destroyed those murderers, and burned up their city. And so those fruits down on the mountain, which are not going to recognize the authority which is above, those will be destroyed. And it can look like a harsh thing, but this is just the natural process of how any world lays itself out. If you're like, let's use another sports analogy, if you're playing a sport, if you're playing basketball and one player doesn't want to participate in the purpose of the team, then you're going to get rid of that player. You're going to cast him out. You're going to eject him from the team because he is a threat to the unity of the team. So
from those in the religious community, Elizabeth I created the Second Witchcraft Act. This was done out of a public outrage over an unknown disease that had spread through England and Ireland. They caused cattle to go blind, with a great many people at the time suspecting witches to be the cause, referring to them commonly as eye biters. The act stated that death was to be the punishment for murder via witchcraft and for blinding cattle, with imprisonment and fines being used for lesser uses of magic. Seizure of property and land for second offenders, and those attempting to murder via witchcraft or to attempt to blind cattle via magic, as well as those found guilty of using love potions. But when James I took over in 1603, he repealed Elizabeth's act and placed in his own that called for the death of anyone found guilty of any form of witchcraft on their first offense, which started England's witch hysteria about 100 years after the rest of Europe. Witch hunters began to be treated like major celebrities, and people like the self-proclaimed witch-finder General Matthew Hopkins and his colleague John Stern hung over 300 women accused of witches in just one of their short 3-year campaigns. Witch hunting in England did not peak until the 1640s, but lasted until 1736, when James's Witchcraft Act would be repealed, making Shakespeare's Weird Sisters from Macbeth in 1611 a commentary on the rising fear of witches within his country, as well as Europe's previous treatment towards witches. Women and men convicted of witches were not burned in England typically and were instead hung in most instances. As The Malleus Maleficarum never really took off in that area, and wasn't even translated into English until about 100 years after it was written, because the English had their own demonologists, such as John Cotta, Richard Baldwin, Thomas Potts, and William Perkins, who did not advocate for the burning of witches. Ireland was the only country in Europe that did not fall into the witch hysteria, and only had 8 trials for witchcraft between the years 1324 and 1711. Over the 400 years that the witch purges raged, it is estimated that several hundreds of thousands of people were executed for being suspected witches or conspirators with witches. I know I already said that, but it bears repeating. The purge eventually spread throughout Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, and to the New World, before finally dying out in the late 1700s, with most executions of people being accused of witches ending in the early to mid 1800s. It's a lot more complicated than that, with different individual movements, periods, and people involved. The Salem witch trials were a thing. But for our purposes, it is suffice to say that there were 400 years of needless, near-constant bloodshed over accusations of witchcraft and devil work. And it wasn't until the mid-1800s before people felt safe to actually critique in the form of art and literature the long history of cruelty that had spread the world over. So come back next time, and we're going to see what they had to say.
Here it is, we're seeing the same thing. Those that oppose the messengers of the king, which come down from above, they have to be gotten rid of one way or the other because they're trouble for the unity of the kingdom. Because they're opposing that which actually binds it together. But then you can imagine now the servants kind of coming lower, both in this invitation, now in judgment, but always coming lower. So the king continues and says to his servants, "The wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Therefore go into the highways, and as many as you find, invite to the wedding." So those servants went out into the highways and gathered together all whom they found, both bad and good, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. So this is already showing us a very mysterious aspect of the fall. That is, as the fall happens, God covers the fall. And so the fall is actually participating in a kind of salvation of the whole world in a very surprising way, which is that as we move away from the glory of God and fall, then God covers the fall. He covers it both with mercy, but also with judgment. And this continuously is happening as you move lower and lower down into the world, down into this cosmic hierarchy. So now we're out into the highway. We're out into this, let's say you can imagine like the valley or the bottom of the mountain where it's all these mixed people that are gathering together, that are crossing each other, that aren't necessarily nations, that are in between spaces, you could say. That's what highways are. They're not cities. They're kind of in between spaces. So he destroys these cities that aren't willing to recognize the union of heaven and earth. And now he's in the in-between spaces, and he gathers all these weird people, all the people that are good and bad, all of the different, all the people that are kind of at the bottom of the hierarchy. Now they actually end up having an opportunity to participate in this. And this is what I told you about. This is kind of one of the amazing things of Christ, is how Christ is filling up the hierarchy, going all the way to the bottom of death and gathering it into God by his story, by the way he's acting, by his message. All of this is what he's doing, and in his actions as well. But now here comes the clinch, here comes the cincher at the end, which is to really show you that this is not a revolutionary movement. This is not, let's say, the people at the bottom of the hierarchy climbing up the mountain and taking what's theirs, getting what was owed to them, or that kind of, let's say, resentful attitude of those that are below. But it's rather this slow extension of the kingdom as those above refuse it even. Let's say the invitation now goes lower and lower to gather everything up through this the mystery of the incarnation, we could say. But when the king came in to see the guests, he saw a man who did not have on a wedding garment. So he said to him, "Friend, how did you come in here without a wedding garment?" And he was speechless. Then the king said to the servants, "Bind him hand and foot, take him away and cast him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen." So here is where you understand that even in the Beatitudes, even as Christ extends the invitation of the kingdom of heaven, fills the kingdom of heaven all the way towards the bottom of the mountain, you could say, all the way right up to the border of the flood, can become the kingdom of heaven. But nonetheless, that which is gathered in has to have the garments of the wedding, have to manifest the union of heaven and earth, even in their lower spheres. And so yes, Christ calls the taxpayers and the prostitutes and the good and the bad and the thieves and all of these people to gather into the kingdom. But it also means that they have to be somewhat transformed. They have to be transformed in a manner that they wear the garments of the union of heaven and earth at the level where they are. So there's absolutely no revolution. There really is an image of how all of this is to show how Christ fills up the hierarchy of being, and how, yes, those that are below, those that are weak, those that are sick, those that are weeping, they can rejoice because the invitation now has been called all the way down to them. They have a way, they have a manner in which they can participate, and they also even exemplify in their poverty or in their lowliness how it is we need to be in regards to that which is above. We need to receive from above, but you have to receive from above. You have to manifest the fruits of the kingdom of heaven, or else you will then again, just like all the other things that didn't manifest as the invitation was coming down the mountain, they will nonetheless be cast out of this world. And so, of course, this is an image of the entire cosmos, but it works once again at every single lower world, let's say. As a world fills up and kind of calls in more and more, for the world to cohere and to exist as a world, those that participate in it nonetheless have to show its colors, have to manifest the fruits of whatever world, whatever team, whatever company that they're participating in. And so I just wanted to go into that a little bit to show you once again how most of the things Christ says are just showing you this pattern of how heaven connects with earth. But there's nothing revolutionary there. There's nothing revolutionary in the way that we understand revolution, the way that we understand the idea that that which is below is somehow owed something from above, or that which is below needs to take from above and needs to get rid. But there is a sense in which the pride of those which are higher up on the hierarchy is often what prevents them from acknowledging what it is that binds them together towards the transcendent. And so there is a danger in those that are above, which is to be prideful, and this is one of the things that Christ calls out to. And it's a completely coherent argument. It's a completely coherent argument about how it is that anything works. Think once again about a sports team. The pride of the players, if they are distracted by their own interests, will damage their capacity to participate in a common goal, will damage their capacity to exist as a team and to attain that which is the very reason why they're together. And so I know this might be a little complicated for those who have been following my work for a while, but hopefully for those who have, this will have been just one more example of how Christ fills the hierarchy in a way in which we all have the capacity to participate, in a way that shows the particular opportunity of those which are below to manifest this relationship, but not at all in a way which is revolutionary in the manner in which the moderns understand this kind of revolutionary, resentful moment. And so I hope this has been useful to you. I thank you all for your attention, and I'll talk to you very soon. So as you noticed, I have just inaugurated the new opening for the Symbolic World. It was recorded.
Pixel Talk will return.